good time to get started. We're going to talk a little bit today about the new OSHA guidelines and what the new OSHA ETS means for your business. It is 490 pages of exciting guidelines, and we're going to do our best to break it down for you. We are joined today by Rosalind Stone from 0 Hour Health and Zedek, and Allison Dodd, who's a partner at Messner Reeves. And we are super excited to have both of them today here to answer questions, kind of help us break down the OSHA ETS, what it means for you. We are sure you have lots of questions. So at any point you can throw them into the Q&A, and we will do our best to get to all of them. But we will spend a few minutes going over first with Rosalind, kind of what is in the OSHA ETS, and then with Allison, some of the legal kind of questions, concerns, and implications about it. So without further ado, would love to get started. Rosalind, you want to kick us off? Oh, Rosalind, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us on a Friday afternoon on relatively short notice. We, for weeks we heard, tomorrow, next day, next week, and sure enough, we had some pretty good information earlier in the week that it was gonna come out this week, and it did. For the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about the vaccination testing portions of the ETS, and then I'm going to kick it over to Allison, who's going to talk about the many legal questions that are both addressed and raised in 490 pages of guidance. So there were some surprises, and there were things that weren't surprises in the ETS. That it goes into effect essentially on December 5th was not something we necessarily expected. We had heard prior to this that the testing component, the Vaxxer test component, would be after the holidays. The National Restaurant Association, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce had very heavily advocated for waiting until after the holidays, and that portion or that consideration was made. But with that said, there's a very specific portion that says that on December 5th, unvaccinated employees must be masked. Some of our clients still have everyone masked. But they certainly will be in a different situation than needing to identify who's vaccinated and not by December 5th if you're not already vaccine tracking. The vaccination mandate is effective January the 4th, so right after the holidays. And by that date, everyone will need to be fully vaccinated, meaning that they will have to have completed their last dose 2 weeks prior, or they will need to go into a weekly testing cycle. Employers can choose between a vaccine mandate, a full or partial, or a testing option. And I'm going to kick that one over to Allison a little in greater depth a little bit later on. But for those of you who have opted to mandate vaccinations, that continues to be allowed or allowable under the OSHA standard. There are clients that have a partial mandate, which means that employees who are front-facing can have a vaccine mandate, while employees who are not, or one division of a company and others. Again, more of a legal question. There were some very interesting things about the testing options. We again will have some more clarity around which employers are covered, but basically all employers with more than 100 employees are included. So that means that if you are a franchisee or a licensee or an operator that has 2 or more locations with more than 50 employees at each, then you are covered if they are one entity. We found for most of our clients, they were covered by the mandate in most industries. So again, unvaxxed employees must be masked effective December the 5th, which is 1 month from today. That is a quick timeline. There was a very interesting thing there about data reporting, and we'll talk a little bit very briefly about our vaccine testing and tracking system later on, but it does require that when OSHA requests data on vaccinations or testing, that you have 4 hours to provide that data. Again, we expected, and it was very similar to what we expected, that there's a requirement for weekly testing for unvaccinated employees, that testing cannot be at home and in some way needs to be observed. Was not something that we necessarily expected to be written in the way that it was and with the clarity that it was. Unsupervised tests are not permitted. For many of you who were asking us questions before this, it was, that was the big question. The question was, if employees can pay for their own tests and couldn't do them everywhere, how do we know that a test is valid? Do we need to validate it? Do we need to verify tests? And those issues are absolutely addressed by by all tests needing to be supervised. Certainly, we're going to talk about it a little further, but that's the portion of this that's extremely challenging. If I could have my next slide, please. So what are our potential pain points? Well, first, the most significant potential pain point is the short timeline. So 1 month from today, you're going to need to know who's vaccinated in order for them to not be masked as of December 5th. There's very little guidance surrounding where they need to be masked. It basically says in the workplace. Some questions came up yesterday about meal times and break times and when people go out on your property to have a cigarette. And we don't necessarily have answers to those questions yet. And again, they may fall into the kind of questions that Allison and I get towards the end. But 4 weeks from now, unvaccinated employees will need to be masked on your property. Obviously, we know that lots and lots of employees get meals as part of their benefits or part of their compensation, and your guests can unmask to eat where masks are required. So there's going to be some real need for clarification surrounding some of those things. But again, 4 weeks from today, we need to know who's vaxxed, and otherwise they need to be masked. And really 9 weeks from today, so January 4th, we'll need to be testing weekly for anyone who's not vaccinated. So again, that timeline presents challenges because if you don't currently have a vaccine testing and tracking and testing system in place, you need to getting that up and running and gathering the information, if you haven't started, on which employees are vaccinated is a significant task. The ETS also talks about notifying employees about this requirement, and that needs to happen very soon. And we'll talk a little bit about the next steps, but one of the very first steps you need to do is communicate with your managers and your employees. There are many challenges to weekly testing. We are very concerned about testing availability, the cost, and how difficult it is to manage weekly testing, especially when it needs to be supervised. For our clients, and many of you who've listened to our earlier webinars have heard us talk about those locations that already needed to implement testing, Honolulu, Maui, Contra Costa County, California, there were some really important lessons learned. And many of those lessons were, it takes a good SOP. It takes a good set of procedures that need to be practiced and need to be taught to manage weekly testing. Many of you are having discussions internally on who's paying for the testing. The ETS clearly says that you can charge employees for their weekly tests. That is literally the question of the hour across many industries, particularly across the restaurant and food service and hospitality industries. Because of the current staffing situation, if another employer is not charging for testing and you are, where does that leave you? It is a complicated and costly question. We are seeing that there's more tests available today than we thought there would be, or that early indications were. And I say that by the number of people who've tried to sell us tests in the last 24 or 48 hours. Where we had seen tests drop a little bit in pricing, they seem to have gone back up a little bit, but there does seem to be some reasonable availability. The potential pain points about getting people vaccinated persist. And for those of you who've heard me speak before, and for those of you that we've talked with, Zero Hour Health and Zedek have spoken to one-on-one, the message for months has been, get people vaccinated. Vaccinations work, and that vaccine mandates also work in getting people who may have been vaccine hesitant, but not necessarily against vaccination, to get vaccinated. If they're not vaccinated, we are currently dealing with combination of flu season, boosters taking place, and needing to get a large number of employees who are unvaccinated vaccinated. And we're going to see some bottlenecks as people are all trying to maneuver through those same channels to get vaccinated. There is a tremendous amount of capacity out there. Vaccinations are free. Some of you have spoken to us about whether or not you should try to arrange on-site vaccines. And we think that on-site vaccinations are a great way to get people vaccinated. Getting them actually coordinated for you to get them on-site now may be challenging. Again, flu season, many providers are very busy with booster doses, and there's so many scheduling scheduling issues. We continue to see hesitancy among certain segments of the population. The segments of the population that we see hesitancy are younger female employees and employees who have language barriers, or employees that are concerned about navigating through this system. So making sure that you direct your communication towards those employees, that you provide them with resources for good information, is really the direction to go at this point. We have talked about this in other webinars previously, but there are certainly challenges in managing the medical and religious exemptions for our clients that have solid, reasonable accommodation processes in place, and accommodations under the ADA. This really is just a natural extension of that. So again, there are many more pain points in this. These are those that we were able to identify, in the first 24 hours of digesting, this tremendously, voluminous document. There are going to be other pain points that we all identified together. So what are the resources that you need now? What people have said to me so many times over the last 24 hours, what do I need to know right now, right this minute? What do we need to focus on? And it's really, I want to say it's simple, but it's not. But there's really sort of three main places to focus your attention at the moment. One is a communication plan, and I will kick this over to Allison in a little while, but the mandate is very clear, has very specific requirements about what you need to tell your employees about the mandate and about testing. And we expect that some of you are working on drafting those communications already. Others, there'll be some templates out there, I'm sure, that Messner Reeves will be able to help at some point. But having a communication plan about the mandate, using the models that are in the document to get it communicated to employees. And that part of that communication also is, hey, what can I do to help you get vaccinated? Do you need help scheduling an appointment? Do you need me to go with you? Do you need a ride? Do you need do you need language support? Do you need a buddy? Do you need time off? The mandate or the ETS clearly says that employees get time to get vaccinated, and they get time off for any side effects or symptoms that they have after vaccination. And it's really important to communicate to employees that you will not be penalized for for these things. You need a vaccination and testing tracking system ASAP, because getting all of this information and having a place for employees to upload their vaccine cards, a place that they'll be able to document their testing, or you document their testing as soon as possible. It is a tight timeline to have that up in a month, and the second half in 2 months. And then last but not least, you need testing solutions. And I'm sure that many of you have, some of the larger testing resources banging on your door because they expect you to buy tens or hundreds of thousands of tests. Others may find that more challenging. There were still some tests available on Amazon this morning, and they were not a bad price. We've had a lot of questions about what has happened to the discounted tests that we had thought would be available, and we don't unfortunately have an answer to that question. We understand that much of the testing that the federal government bought up went to nursing homes, senior living facilities, and other kinds of healthcare institutions. We are waiting to hear whether or not there are other kinds of testing discounts available for employers. But we are seeing that capacity is continuing to ramp up. There's some really interesting and creative channels that we've seen over the last few days for obtaining testing. One of our clients bought a large volume of tests through their first aid supplier. Others are using medical distributors. Some are using the labs that you've been using for testing all along. Our opinion throughout, and this is probably more a legal read than a clinical one, but is that if testing isn't available, it can't be required of us. So we do expect that testing will continue to ramp up, or testing capacity will continue to ramp up, but that we don't see now how you could possibly be required to test if you can't purchase tests for your employees to meet this requirement. I think that sort of summarizes where we are on the clinical read of vaccinations, testing, tracking. I did want to, I'll now turn it over back to you, Jen, and you can turn it over to Allison or straight on with a legal break.
Thank you so much, Rosalind. Appreciate it. Yeah, so now we're going to turn it over to Allison Dodd from Messner Reeves, who is going to take us through some of the kind of legal breakdown of this OSHA update. We know that you're probably chock full of both kind of clinical and legal questions. I already see plenty of them in the Q&A, so please continue to add any questions in the Q&A as they come up, and we'll get to them afterwards, we promise. But Allison, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thanks, Jen. And thanks everyone for joining today. A quick disclaimer before I get started. The content I'm discussing today is for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice. Definitely consult with counsel of your choice before taking any actions based on what we discussed today. So the first topic I want to talk about is how do you even determine if you're a covered employer, right? So employees within that analysis of the 100 companies that have 100 plus employees or more are covered under this ETS standard. So what employees, what does that even mean? So anyone that works remote is included. Anyone that's part-time. If you have multiple locations, I think Rosalind already mentioned this, all of your locations are counted in that overall total. Minors are included in that total. People that aren't, if you have any independent contractors, they are not included. If you have people that work in your office from staffing agencies that are separate and independent from your office, they are not included. So I know a lot of questions we're getting is about like franchisee, franchisor relationships. If the franchisee is independently owned and operated, that is separate and independent from the franchisor. So the franchisee would not need to count that corporate level employee number from the franchisor. Now, there is a gray area where we expect to have a bunch of comments on the OSHA ETS is where you have companies that have multiple LLCs or whatever tied to them, but they still operate under like common ownership and common policies and procedures. The most conservative approach would be to count all of those employees under that big umbrella to that 100 count. Right now, there's nothing saying you can't, separate that out and, have one LLC only has 75, one LLC has, 90, and those are separate entities. However, keep in mind that in the regulations themselves, it does say if they're owned and operated by the same principals and people, they're likely going to be counted. That's not been clarified yet, so keep that in mind. Technically, right now, we're in this gray area, so you can likely operate that way until we hear otherwise, but that is a risk. There will be situations also where the franchisee is not covered and the franchisor is, and vice versa. So be prepared for that as well. Turning into kind of the exemption phase, the ETS, as Roz mentioned, gives 3 options. You can have a mandatory vaccination policy. You can have a partial mandatory vaccination policy. That means you can choose if there is a group of employees that you're going to require vaccinations for, and a group of employees that you're going to say you can either be vaccinated or get tested. Examples of this, if you have a group of employees that are public facing, say you are a large restaurant chain and your restaurant level employees are customer facing, you want them to all be vaccinated, but your corporate level employees that are in an office building somewhere that don't have customer consumer interaction, you opt for them to have a testing and vaccination policy. That is permitted under the ETS. And then the last one we know is the vaccination and testing policy. So with vaccination and testing mandates, there are, exemption issues, right? So employees who are exempted from this ETS are employees who do not report to the workplace where other individuals are present, who work from home, or who work exclusively outdoors. So if they have to 100% work outdoors, they can't come inside and outside, they have to work outdoors 100% of the time to be excluded from the ETS mandates. So other exemptions are obviously like religious and medical exemptions. And then that bodes the reasonable accommodation analysis and engaging in the interactive process that employers are required to go through with those employees who either claim they cannot comply with the vaccination mandate or testing mandate because of medical or religious reasons. Employers should already have reasonable steps in place, and you follow the same procedures to determine whether the request is reasonable, whether you can accommodate it reasonably, and how you can work through that process with the employee. We're getting a lot of questions about if you have a mandatory vaccination policy, can you terminate an employee who refuses to comply? Under the OSHA ETS, they say you absolutely can. However, from a legal perspective, I would caution all employers on, taking that stance right now without first consulting with counsel, with legal implications such as employment considerations. Is there a failure to accommodate? Is there religious discrimination concerns? Is there an employment agreement or a collective bargaining issue that might be breached because of that? You have to, look at the legal risks associated with creating that kind of a policy. Not to say you can't do it, but just be prepared for some legal complications or ramifications if you choose to go down that route, and definitely consult with counsel as to best protect yourself if you choose to take that approach. The next topic I want to briefly touch on is the state and local laws preempted. So, there's been a couple of states already that have banned or limited mandates for vaccinations, face coverings, or testing. Those are effectively preempted by this ETS standard, meaning that they are no longer in effect, and the ETS is controlling effective today. So there are exceptions if a state has an approved OSHA plan, and there's 22 of them out there that have OSHA approved state plans. So if the states decide, if those 22 states decide to adopt state specific plans, they must be at least as effective and cannot be inconsistent with the ETS. So if you operate in those 22 states, you're either going to have to abide by the ETS standard, the federal standard that we are looking at today, or more stringent state specific ones. They can't be less effective, and they can be inconsistent. So of note, the Texas and Florida, the big hot button states right now, don't have state specific OSHA plans. So as of today, they are under the federal ETS standard. But we fully expect lawsuits to come from numerous states, including Florida and Texas. Just for a point of clarification, there has already been 17 lawsuits filed on the federal contractor vaccination mandate by individual states. So we fully expect more to be filed on this one that came out yesterday. So looking to that, which will make it even more complicated if certain states adopt stricter standards, but knowing that this ETS at least sets the baseline for what you can expect going forward. Turning next to what you are required to do with your employees. So you have to provide up to 4 hours of paid time to get the vaccine. You have to pay for employees to recover from side effects if they claim to have any. OSHA's guidance right now seems to say that about 2 days per vaccination dose is reasonable for recovery. You also have to provide information to your employees about the vaccination testing policy. This includes telling your employees about criminal penalties associated with knowingly supplying false statements or documentation, which could be up to $10,000 fine or 6 months imprisonment. And you're required to notify your employees of that, as well as various other information. And then, as Rosalind mentioned, you have to obtain and maintain vaccination status and testing records. What employers are not required to do are pay for testing or face covering costs. However, you need to think about wage and hour considerations if you require employees to pay for testing, or depending on how expensive face coverings are, if that makes their wages fall below the minimum wage per state or federal laws, you might have some wage and hour implications there. We don't know yet. We'll see how that plays out, but that's something we're anticipating employees will raise if they're engaging in weekly testing and it becomes costly. You also do not have to pay for transportation costs associated with getting vaccinated. You just have to pay for the time spent getting vaccinated. Now turning next, I think I briefly mentioned OSHA penalty provisions. So for employees, like I said, there can be criminal penalties for falsifying your vaccination records or testing records, or potentially COVID positive or negative results. For employers, OSHA's maximum penalty amounts for a serious violation, it's $13,653 per violation. For a willful or repeated violation, it can be up to $136,000. So OSHA really goes through in the regulations issued yesterday how they have authority to separately cite employers for each instance of an employer's failure to protect employees and for each affected employee where appropriate, meaning they are likely going to take the position that every employee, every violation is one violation. So potentially $13,000 per violation. So that adds up quickly. Willful violations, examples of those are a large number of illnesses, bad faith, or extensive history of noncompliance. And that's that $136,000 number for a willful violation. Now, I can only find where they've issued 2 willful violations since the start of the pandemic. But this ETS attempts to clarify OSHA's authority to more readily issue these types of citations. And these are the maximum amounts allowed under OSHA. OSHA is still subject to the laws and statutory process as it always has been. So it has to follow the same regulations regarding inspections, citations, and penalties. So that's consistent with any previous OSHA experience you might have had as an employer. They still have to go through the OSHRC for any disputes, and that is a separate body independent of OSHA and the Department of Labor. So that at least is all still consistent with prior approaches and the prior process. So I'll touch briefly on the compliance timeline. I believe Rosalind already talked a little bit about it, but as of December 5th, employers must have a policy on vaccination, determine the vaccination status of each employee and obtain that proof, start maintaining records of vaccination status, require face coverings for unvaccinated employees, provide the emergency temporary standard information and workplace policies to all employees, and then provide records upon request by OSHA or employees. So if OSHA requests the roster and your records of vaccination proof, you have to provide those within 4 hours. You also have to report work-related COVID hospitalizations within 24 hours. You have to report fatalities related to COVID within 8. And if an employee requests their records, you have to give them to them within the next business day. And that all happens on December 5th. The January 4th deadline is the requirement for employees to be fully vaccinated or implement the testing program for unvaccinated employees. Now, OSHA can start enforcing as soon as December 5th. We don't necessarily anticipate they will do that, but that's not to say they won't. So it's more than likely they'll start in the beginning of the year, but they have the authority and ability to do so starting December 5th. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jen and welcome any questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I know that there's lots of questions already. Please drop your questions into the Q&A section specifically if you've got questions for Allison. I know it's full of them, so we'll keep it quick and get right into the Q&A. Really quickly, we had a couple of, I think, Rosalind, you want to talk a little bit about our vaccination and testing tracking just for 2 seconds, and then I will follow up with the slides so that anyone here can contact 0 Hour Health or contact Allison and Messner Reeves if you have any questions or follow up from today.
Thank you. And I'm really just 15 seconds. Some of you who are on this call are already using our vaccination and testing tracking system. We've had it up and running. We've had to make only minor modifications to it based on the ETS. We were really pleased that our system already allowed you to pull your own reports, or for us to help you with reports, to provide that data within 4 hours. Our system already allows for employees to see their own testing results. But again, we have a very simple vaccination testing and tracking system that's working extremely well. And we've had the experience with many of our clients to get it up and running and working effectively. So Jen, if you would flip to the next slide, you will be getting an email after this webinar with a link to schedule a time if you want a demo of the vaccination and tracking and testing system, or you can email danp@getzedek.com. Again, legal questions to Allison Dodd at Messner.com. Jen, questions? There are many of them.
Beautiful. Yes, I'm going to go ahead and stop the share so that we can see each other's faces, because we are going to be answering many questions. We have a lot coming in. I will preface this by saying we'll do our best to get to every question. I'll be answering some of them on chat as well. If we don't get to your question live, we will follow up with an answer to your question to the best of our ability. And I'm going to do my best to kind of mix it up, go back and forth between some of our legal and more clinical questions. Allison, this one is for you to start it off. We have a couple of different questions about who is eligible under, or rather who's required to follow this mandate. So we had a couple of different ones, and I'll do my best to kind of consolidate them. But basically, if there are different owners of kind of not quite franchise alignment, but if there are different owners of companies, and though they have less than 100 employees under each owner, would those people be considered or be required to follow this mandate?
Yeah, so this is kind of the gray area I was talking about. You have to be careful because if the companies are separate entities but have basically the same operating structure, operating personnel, same decision makers, they could be considered as one employer. But you can argue, the other way, that they are completely separate LLCs, companies, and they should be independently operated and they don't count. So right now, with what we know today, they are separate entities. I expect that will be clarified with the comment sections. So, I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer, but those are the considerations you need to make. Obviously, most conservative approach, the safest approach, is to consider it one entity if they have common management, policies, procedures, et cetera. And it's more of a formality that they have separate entities. It might be disingenuous to say, like, our employees receive their paychecks from this LLC and are managed by, our company is managed by this LLC, so they're separate and independent. Those kind of considerations, you have to, do a deep dive as to like what the regulations intend. And, if you're trying to circumvent that, that might be a bad faith argument OSHA or someone could make, saying, you should be in compliance and you did not operate in good faith by not being in compliance.
Great, thank you. All right, we've got lots of questions about testing. So I'm gonna move into like the testing section. We have a couple of different questions about supervised tests. And I actually already answered one live that I'll just briefly speak to, which is that there was some questions around like, what does a supervised test mean? And I do just want to clarify, OSHA has said that what they mean is that the test can't be both self-administered and self-read. And so either the company, the employer, can proctor the test, or the test can be self-done by the employee, but supervised by an authorized telehealth provider. So those are the two options they've given. There is definitely some question around, whether smart apps might be acceptable as a supervised telehealth provider. And we're, again, waiting for more clarification from OSHA. And we'll kind of keep people informed about that. But a question for you, Rosalind, that I think is a great one to kind of kick us off, which is, assuming that a employer decides to go with weekly testing for unvaccinated employees, do you have a recommendation if they were going to provide, the employer was going to provide those tests? A, kind of which tests should they buy? And then B, is there a recommendation for how that should be done? Should they do it at the beginning of the shift? Should it be outside of the restaurant? Should it be at the end of the shift in the back of the house? So kind of what tests and how should they actually administer those tests?
Good series of questions, and questions again that we were able to work through some procedures in those locations that have required them already. We do believe that they should be done at the beginning of the shift, and they should be done at the beginning of the shift so that someone has had less than 15 minutes of close contact if in fact they test positive. Keeping in mind that the employees that are being tested are your employees that are most likely to become infected with COVID because they are unvaccinated. One of the things that we have talked about in some of the prior webinars is one of the lessons learned was not to wait until the date that this starts to do all of your first round of testing, because you will see some positives. That was a really important lesson learned in the places that implemented testing mandates already. There are currently 9 kinds of emergency use authorized rapid antigen tests that do not need to be supervised by a medical professional. They are, there are some differences between them. The only requirement that we suggest that you look very closely at is the length of testing time. Some of them take as little as 10 minutes and some as long as 30 minutes. Back to that 15 minutes of close contact. If someone is coming in, doing a test, going to work, and while the test is running, which many of our clients are doing already, you want to minimize the amount of time that they're at work so that, again, if you could stay under that 15 minutes of close contact, then you don't have to worry about contact tracing for that person who's being tested if they're asymptomatic and they haven't necessarily worked in the previous 48 hours before that test. So do we have a favorite brand? There are some that we like better than others. I don't know if you can see behind me, but I had an array of rapid antigen tests lined up behind me. I think I have them all, but I'm not positive that I do. The Abbott ID Binax is very, very easy to use. So are some of the others. I just had one comment about the telemedicine ones. We love them. They're fantastic. They are supervised, or they are considered supervised by being performed in front of someone on a camera like this. They are very expensive and likely cost prohibitive. So we hoped the prices for those would come down. There are some public testing options, and some of our clients are looking at those, where you send someone to a health department or an outside medical professional for testing. And some of our clients are looking at that, keeping in mind that you do need to pay for testing time if you do it in that way. So I hope I answered that, at least didn't provide too many more questions rather than resolve them.
That's great. Thank you. One more quick follow-up question for you on that one. Cindy is asking, in the past, they've had some providers push back on rapid tests, saying that they prefer PCR. Do we expect for that to be an issue, or do we think that people will ramp up rapid testing, knowing that it's not for symptomatic employees, but really just a compliance thing that they need to do in order to go to work?
That's a good question, and I don't really have a direct answer to that. There are many urgent cares and other places that are doing rapid tests. They are much, much more expensive than supervising them yourselves. Many of you have heard me say this already. I never, ever wanted to see our clients have to get into the on-site testing without a medical professional business. We'd rather see you run restaurants and retail establishments and communications companies and all those good things, and not be in the testing business. But as soon as you send somebody someplace else for a rapid test, it's going to be more expensive. So, with that said, yes, we do think that there are going to be rapid tests widely available, both supervised outside of your workplaces, and again, many of our clients considering supervising them in the workplace.
Great. Last one before we need to dive into some of these many, many legal questions. Do we know yet whether an employer could proctor via Zoom or video versus whether that has to be a telehealth provider? Could the employer proctor remotely is the question. It's a really
I don't know the answer to that question. If you would file that one away, we hopefully will get clarity surrounding that.
I do know, I can say this. I've read some of the comments about, like, I've read a lot about the supervised. I don't think that OSHA has come out with a clear answer for that. They do say an employer can proctor. That's probably one we're going to need to wait for clarification on whether that's able to be remote. Okay. Allison, we've got many for you. How about, we've got a bunch of questions about inside outside. So employees who are working outside, like, for example, taking drive-through orders, or delivery drivers who only come in to grab an order and leave, would those people be exempt, or would they still be covered?
So I think the delivery drivers is more of a gray area. They haven't addressed really well yet, but what I would say is, based on the comments I've seen so far, the outdoor onlys, like, exemption from this really applies to, like, workers that truly only work outside, that aren't going into the premises at any point. So right now, if they go inside to pick up a delivery, they're not exempt. If they're working a drive-through outside, go inside to grab something, they're not exempt, until we get clarification otherwise.
Great.
You'd
And so
heard the
then that,
intent of that was for landscape personnel, construction and those kinds of positions.
yeah. So that leads me to a different interpretation of the word outside. That's my segue, which is, what about, delivery drivers is a good example. What about third-party vendors or volunteers, things like that? Are those people counted in employees? Are they exempt from these rules if they're not employees of your own company?
Right. So employers are only required to apply this to their own employees. So volunteers would not apply. Independent contractors would not apply. Visitors to your facilities would not apply. Doesn't apply to the head count, doesn't apply to your requirements to maintain their vaccination status, provide them with information, et cetera.
Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, on to religious exemptions and all sorts of exemptions. First of all, we know that there's a religious exemption for there's the possibility of religious exemptions for vaccination. But obviously this ETS creates the testing option for people who are exempt from vaccination or choose not to be vaccinated. Is there a religious exemption for testing?
So there's no set in stone what is a religious exemption or what is not. So if you have an employee come to you and say, I need a religious exemption because of I need a religious exemption for testing, you have to engage in that interactive process. You have to figure out what is the basis for it. You have a right to do that. And then you have a right to determine if it's reasonable or not. You still have to engage in the interactive process, even if it sounds extremely far-fetched and unfounded, but you still have to engage in it. If they claim a religious exemption for a testing mandate, you have to engage in the interactive process, and we'll see how it plays out, but you still have to go through it.
Great, thank you. And then follow up to that, if they can't be vaccinated because if someone receives a religious exemption for vaccination, do you then need to pay for or medical exemption, actually? If someone is exempt for religious or medical reasons, do you then need to pay for those weekly tests that those people need to undergo?
OSHA makes it clear that you do not need to pay for those tests. An employer can obviously opt into paying for the test, but OSHA has not commented on whether an employer needs to pay for a test due to an exemption. The EEOC has not issued, nor the ADA has issued any guidance on that. So as of today, no, the employer is not required to pay for that. Will that change? Perhaps, but it's not in the ETS standards right now.
Great, thank you. Okay, back to Roslyn with a clinical question here. We're getting some questions. I love how creative people are in this chat. Questions about pooled testing, wastewater testing. Is there a way that we could do larger scale testing, probably in a more cost efficient way?
Great question, and not a question we've been asked before. We have had, some of you use our wellness checks in our sick call program. And when an employee fails their daily wellness check, they tell us that they live in a dorm or that they live in a facility that's doing pool testing and someone in their pool tested positive. We have not excluded that employee because they are potentially one of 200 or 400 people in that specimen pool. We haven't had this question before. We don't have a direct answer to it. We believe that pool testing will become a solution in the United States. How it applies to this is difficult to know because the turnaround time for pool testing is significantly longer than 15 minutes for a rapid antigen test or even the few hours for rapid PCRs. So good question, don't have an answer, think it will evolve, widely used in Europe.
Great, thank you. I do know that there is some OSHA commentary on pool testing that they put out today with some clarifications on that. So we can kind of direct you to that as well. Okay, we've got some interesting questions for you, Allison, around minors.
Good questions.
What's the deal when we have employees that are under 18 is my very eloquent way of combining a number of questions about that. Do we need parental consent? What else do we need to consider when we're kind of considering our underage employees?
So you operate any type of process with minors should be the same that with this ETS, right? So any time you have to request something from a minor that requires parental consent, it does not change with the ETS. So if you have to get a doctor's note from a minor or request it or require it and it needs parental consent, the same applies in this scenario. So nothing changes with the minor analysis. If you have to do it before, you're going to have to do it now. So that's the guidance, and it makes it more complicated, obviously. But if you have to do it outside of the pandemic, you're going to have to do it within these standards as well.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Maybe.
Maybe, because this is a question near and dear to our hearts. Do you think that we can get parental consent once for testing, or that we need parental consent weekly?
So that's an unknown right now, right? So I mean, I'd say conservative, every weekly consent, but this is a gray area that's going to need clarification. If the ETS, if OSHA wants to address the specific ETS implications of, minors in the workforce, which we know a lot of our restaurant clients have a large percentage of them. So it's, as I read it, every time you're requesting some sort of medical record issue from a minor, you need parental consent unless clarified. But that's the most conservative, least legal risky approach.
Thank you.
Great. Crushing through this list. Good work. Okay, so we have some questions around the recording and employee vaccination and testing status. MJ is asking, what's required to validate the vaccination status? Is that a picture? Is it a signed attestation? Is it something else?
So it's all of the above, right? Attestation, that's what was, I guess, most surprising probably to Rosalind and myself, is that the ETS allows for employees to attest that they received a vaccination. There is language on the OSHA website that you need to have the employer verify and sign if they're going to do an attestation. And that kind of goes with that criminal penalty informative language that you also have to provide with the employees. Hey, if you're going to attest that you got the vaccine and not provide us with physical documentation, you potentially are subject to criminal penalties and or jail time up to 6 months or $10,000 if you falsify this attestation and we find out. The employer is also on the hook if they have a good faith belief that the attestation is false or any documentation provided is false. you can be subject to an OSHA violation for that as well. So, there are various forms that OSHA outlines. It's in their FAQs, it's on their little one pager. But yeah, they have to provide you with proof of the vaccination. And it can be as simple as a picture of your vaccine card, but the employer is required to maintain it and required to provide it to OSHA upon request.
Great. Thank you. And just a quick follow-up. I was about to answer this and then realized I just want to be super clear with you, Allison. We know that the ETS is clear that employers do not need to pay for testing. That includes paying for the time that the employee takes to go get that test, correct?
Correct. You're not required to pay for any sort of transportation costs. The only thing an employer is required to pay for is related to a vaccination. So if they get a vaccination, they are the employer has to pay up to 4 hours of time per dose for that employee to get vaccinated. And then they also have to pay for any sick related leave they need to take from any complications from the vaccine. And OSHA did say employers can set a cap on the maximum amount of sick leave provided. And they also said, a reasonable time would be 2 days of sick leave per dose.
Great, thank you. Okay, I've hit the limit of how I can bundle the remaining questions, and we're just gonna ask them one at a time now. Maybe this might be a question for both of you. What's the kind of read on whether OSHA is actually going to be able to enforce this, and whether they're, whether and how they're going to actually do that?
I'll take a crack at it first. That was the $1 million or the $1 billion question before the ETS came out. The ETS had way more detail about the turnaround time for data submission. So if there is, there are a very limited number of OSHA inspectors in this country, and even in the states that have state OSHA inspectors, it's still a very limited number, comparative to the number of employers that are covered by this standard. With that said, the way the data submission was very, very clearly stated, absolutely expanded their reach. Allison, what do you think?
Well, we know that they've had issues with the other ETSs and getting violations and issuing all of that. So we know they've already struggled with the other standards that have already come out. We anticipate they are going to be inundated with calls from employees self-reporting employer violations. You have disgruntled employees in your workforce, who doesn't? And they're just going to inundate OSHA with complaints. And who knows how, if they're, I mean, I haven't seen or heard that they're on a big hiring spree to train inspectors. It will more likely be, routine inspections, and they find COVID related violations as a part of those inspections. They still have to follow the processes and the statutory regulations outlined in their guidelines. That has not changed. So they have some level of control they have to follow to even, get to these levels to issue these citations. So I would say they're going to be scrambling for a while, just based on probably employee complaints, and then trying to catch up with their OSHA related inspections that really went down during the pandemic. But it's entirely possible they issue some sort of memorandum saying we want to hire 100,000 more employees to do inspections. They haven't done that yet, but they could.
Great. All right. Okay, back to the kind of the clinical side for a second. Does the ETS mention anything around close contact exclusions or contact tracing that's new or different that we need to be aware of? This one's for you, Rosalind.
It does not, and that question came up earlier today in a real life example. There is not a reference to close contact and contact tracing in the ETS. There are many references to the CDC guidelines. So if the CDC guidelines or your state guidelines require contact tracing, the expectation is that you conduct your contact tracing. But Allison, I did not see anything about contact tracing in the ETS, did you?
No.
Great. All right. How about back to vaccination? Obviously, we know that our first line of defense here is going to be trying to get as many employees vaccinated before this is an issue. And we know that there is some requirement, like you mentioned, Allison, for paid time to recover from side effects from vaccination. Is there a maximum amount of paid time listed or a minimum? Are there time limits at all for side effect recovery?
So no, there isn't. OSHA said employers can set a cap. So if if employees claim they need sick leave for this, OSHA did say employers can set a cap. And they also said a reasonable amount of time to recover is 2 days per dose. So I would say 4 days of paid sick leave to recover for your 2 doses, 1 day if you have, the 1 dose.
Great. And then is there any way that an employer would need to go back and pay for vaccines that people have already gotten, or pay for the time that it took them to go get vaccines that they've already received?
I have not seen a retroactive application of this. So unless they modify and say that, the answer is no.
I would think that would be very difficult.
Great.
That would be very unusual.
Excellent. All right. We got about 4 minutes left, probably enough time for 1 or 2. I am kind of looking through. We do have a number of questions about about documentation. Like, what documentation will be required? Are these attestations allowed? Kind of things along those lines. And also keeping the documents. So maybe real quick, Allison, could you speak a little bit to what the ETS says about the documentation piece? And then Rosalind, we're getting lots of questions specifically about the ZHH tracker and how we'll build things into it that allow for those. So maybe we can finish up with a quick answer to some of those questions.
Yeah, sure. So employers are required to maintain vaccination status and testing records of employees. And this must be preserved while this ETS remains in effect. And they said this was going to remain into effect for 6 months. And then it will either come into permanent law or they will extend. So you have to maintain your records for this at least while the ETS remains in effect. And so it requires vaccination proof of all of your employees that are vaccinated, and for the employees that are not exempted, the weekly testing data. And so you have to maintain those in a way that you can easily produce within 4 hours to OSHA if requested. So however you maintain your documents, you have to be able to show them the proof of the vaccination status or the proof of the testing.
I'll pick it up from there. Our vaccine and testing tracking system is secure, follows HIPAA guidelines, and maintains these records for perpetuity. We do have a read on this, that the way that it's being published in the Federal Register and the reference to the general duty clause led people to believe that 6 months was how long it was going to take to have a comment period, modify the rules, and potentially make it a permanent rule. The way that reference to the general duty clause sort of wove its way through the ETS. Again, our testing and tracking system does do that. There are others out there, there are some other systems out there that do as well, but ours, we had built all of those pieces into it, having a visual of the card, of the test, of the type of test, of the dosage, of the doses, the lots, all that information that could be required.
Yeah, and I'll just add, if I didn't already mention, the ETS requires you treating the vaccination records and testing records as medical records. So that's a good rule of thumb. However you maintain medical records of your employees now is how you should maintain vaccination and testing records of your employees going forward.
Fabulous. Thank you both so much. Unfortunately, that's all of our time. I know that there are a few more questions that we haven't quite gotten to. And so we will absolutely do our best to, we'll keep track of all of those, and we will shoot you an email if we haven't gotten to your question. And we'll put some of these Q&As as well in our follow-up from this webinar. So we are incredibly grateful for everyone's time. And Rosalind and Allison, thank you both so much. Stay tuned. We'll certainly have more. Make sure if you're not already that you're getting our executive briefing twice a week from 0 Hour Health and Zedic, and we answer best questions all the time, often with cameos from Allison and the Messner Reeves team who help us answer some of the legal questions. And in the follow-up, we'll also make sure that we send out Allison's email and contact information for ZHH so that if you do have any other questions after today, we can absolutely get to those. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great time.